The last topic we discussed is the future of global environmental governance. And here I ask folks to channel their inner Hannah Ritchie, who is a pragmatic optimist and sees the scope for tremendous potential in this space, that we have the technologies available to us to manage resources more efficiently, and we have the data and information sources to be aware of where the problems are. And if we can marshal both our awareness of where the problems are and the technologies to address them, that we stand a chance of continuing human flourishment, but not at the expense of the environment. And that's the most optimistic take that I'd like to think is something that could be realized in the next 10 to 20 years and would decouple improvements in human well-being from environmental impact. Even as I think Hannah Ritchie persuasively argues that we can do this, it's not clear we will. And that requires considerable political effort and tailored solutions that are specific to the various problems we face. And so the lessons of the class encourage us to be mindful of what the political environment is that we're facing, what are the problems that we face. So in terms of the wider political environment, I encourage people to go back to Johannes Urpeleinen's 2022 book, which noted how the structure of global environmental politics has changed. And as we talked about earlier in the semester, we're in a world in which there are more states with the capacity to destroy, that those states tend to have weaker attachments to environmental protection, and they also have relatively weak state capacity to implement environmental policies. And so that means that it's going to be more complicated to resolve problems that require many actors, that those actors aren't going to be as interested in classic environmental problems like conservation of wildlife, for example, that they, to the extent that they have environmental interests, they're concerned about impacts of degradation on human well-being, and that they're going to need some help with administrative capacity to be able to implement. And they may be disinterested in treaty-based approaches or less interested because they want to give themselves some certainty that they can comply with whatever agreements they enter into, and treaties might be seen as too rigid. And so that's in the mix as we think about, can we seize upon the opportunities available to us that Hannah Ritchie talks about, but we're in a political environment in which we've got a more complex world of global diplomacy. And that's setting aside all of the other developments that are happening in international politics of late, with the stance of the US, for example, and China's rise. So in a world in which there are more countries with increased power to destroy, with less interest in environmental protection and limited state capacity, then we may need to think about focused efforts that would be attractive to them, both issues that they care about and technical assistance to make it possible for them to participate. Over the course of the semester, I also likened our efforts to diagnose and develop solutions for environmental problems to be like a medical doctor assessing what ails a patient. And so there are a series of questions that we can ask to try to figure out what the appropriate remedies are. So if the problem is one of uncertainty and lack of information about a particular problem, then we might think about how to address that, and that might require more dedication to scientific inquiry and exploration to shed light on what is causing a particular problem. If we think the problem is more about state capacity to implement and address a known problem, then that's a fixable solution that requires investments in improving the regulatory capacity and resources for the states in question that are responsible for the problem. If we think the issue is building trust, that really the issue is that countries lack trust in each other to take important steps to foster cooperation, then we might think about confidence building measures that might restore trust. If we think the problem is more about enforcement and cheating, then we know that there are limitations in the international system, but they're not zero. And so at the very least, we can think about sunlight, naming and shaming, and putting pressure on countries for their failure to live up to agreements. There may be more robust efforts, sometimes through issue linkage, that might link an environmental problem to, say, trade, where enforcement mechanisms are more robust. If the problem ultimately is about insufficient concern for the environment, then how do we change that? That may be a more long-lived process of education and values change that takes a while, or requires local interlocutors that have trust from their citizens in being able to make a compelling case that a particular problem, whether it be elephant ivory or what have you, is something that local actors ought to be concerned about. But as we come back to our sense of global environmental governance going forward, I want to think that Hannah Ritchie's right, that we have the available tools and diagnostics to be able to see the world and understand it, and we have technologies that will allow us to use resources more efficiently. Even as I want her to be right, I recognize that we're a long way off from that, particularly given the current structure of international politics. But we have to make meaning for ourselves and continue to address these problems, because we only have one planet, and the environment provides essential ecosystem services for us all, including non-human species. And so if we don't seize upon this imperative, we do so at our collective peril. So I encourage folks who, if you watch this video series, that you take that to heart and be mindful and pragmatic and optimistic, but keep that impetus alive, because we need your efforts to be successful going forward.